Good afternoon. I'm Karen Ciesielski, CEO of the Irish Environmental Network, a national network of 34 environmental NGOs which work to conserve and restore nature, to campaign for change, and to empower communities throughout the country. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon and also to be joined by our Voices for Nature panelists, whom I'll now briefly introduce before we get started with a panel discussion, and then we hope there'll be lots of time for questions from yourselves. Pádraic Fogarty is a campaign officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust and the environmental pillar representative on the National Biodiversity Forum. Oonagh Duggan is head of policy and advocacy with Birdwatch Ireland, working towards a better future for birds and their habitats. Oonagh also sits on the National Biodiversity Forum as well as the CAP Consultative Committee. Sadhbh O'Neill is lecturer in climate politics and policy at Dublin City University and was lead author on a recent report called Voices for Environmental Justice in Ireland. Sadhbh was the former policy coordinator of the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition and an advisor to the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action in the last Dáil. Michael McCarthy Flynn is head of policy and advocacy at Oxfam Ireland. Oxfam has been a leading advocate at the global level for economic systems, especially sustainable food systems that work in harmony with nature and provide fair livelihoods for small farmers around the world. Anabel O'Hora is 16 years old and is passionate about sustainability, the environment, and particularly biodiversity. Anabel became involved with ECO-UNESCO through the Youth for Sustainable Development programme and now represents them at the newly founded National Youth Assembly of Ireland. She's represented her school at the Irish Second Level Students' Union for 2 years and has been elected to the Education for Sustainable Development Working Group. Dr. Donal Griffin is the Marine Policy Officer at Fair Seas Ireland, a campaign to protect, conserve, and restore Ireland's unique marine environment. Donal has worked on policy issues such as marine protected areas, sustainable fisheries, and marine spatial planning. I'd like to warmly welcome all of our panelists this afternoon and you, and really to open the session with a question for everyone. We are now in day 2 of the National Biodiversity Conference, where we've heard from lots of speakers about biodiversity in Ireland, about what's going wrong and what needs to change. I'd like to ask our panelists, what have your key takeaways been from the last day and a half? And what are you hopeful about as we look to the next National Biodiversity Action Plan? So who would like to come in first? Pádraic.
Thanks very much, Karen. Good afternoon, everybody. I think it's great to be at this conference. Many of you were probably here in 2019. I think even since we were here in 2019, the urgency and the intensity of the climate and the biodiversity emergency has only escalated. And while it's wonderful to have heard the Taoiseach this morning and ministers yesterday, reflect that in their speeches, I think many of us, I would hope, would agree that really we're not winning this battle at the moment. And I've been to a number of the sessions today and yesterday, and I've heard from a lot of wonderful community groups and small-scale projects around the place. But there is an elephant in the room, and that is our food system. And this conference ostensibly is about producing our next biodiversity action plan. But we have loads of plans. Actually, we did a demonstration yesterday about, Michael D. Higgins was here 3 years ago saying we're up to our knees in dead canaries. We're also up to our knees in action plans and strategies and frameworks and so on and so forth. And none of them seem to be working. And maybe one other plan that might give us a clue as to why it's not working is a plan called Food Smart 2030, which came out last year. And that aims for Ireland to be one of the most sustainable food-producing countries in the world, when plainly the plan isn't. In fact, that plan is working against a lot of the aims that we're trying to talk about in this room, about cleaning our water and restoring ecosystems and reducing greenhouse gases. And just before I'll stop talking, I was at the Bloom Festival last weekend in the Phoenix Park. And the Bloom Festival had over 100,000 people from all over Ireland go through it. And the greenwashing at that festival was a sight to behold. And many of the people who were doing the greenwashing were also at Bloom with their messages about safeguarding biodiversity and how everything we're doing is fantastic. So it's not a very hopeful note. I know, Karen, you wanted a hopeful note. But I think really what we have to do is end the greenwashing and start bringing these plans together in a concerted way so that we actually start making progress on these crises.
Thanks, Gord. Oonagh.
Yeah, my takeaways from the conference, it has been great to see everybody, and yes, I agree with Pádraic that since 2019 there's been a huge push in recognition of the climate and biodiversity emergencies. But one thing I think we're missing, and it kind of became clear to me in the last session today, was that we're talking about, you know, agriculture policy and forestry policy and planning and all the different sectors and fisheries, and they're all working in their silos, and we have a conference about the different areas, but there's no overarching policy or national statement for what we want to see for biodiversity. The Biodiversity Action Plan, it's a plan, but what I think to support an all of government, all of society approach, we need an overarching policy to say this is what we're going to do and have that integrated into every government department. And so, but I suppose it's even like just backtracking a tiny bit, like we're not seeing policy with nature as its focus. What I would imagine, what I'd love to see happen in my ideal world is that all of the sectors fit into biodiversity rather than biodiversity fitting into the sectors. Like in the planning session, I really felt like we're squeezing out biodiversity everywhere. It's squeezed in all of the sectors. And until we actually put biodiversity at the center, we're not going to achieve our goals.
Thanks, Oonagh. Would any of our other panelists like to come in on this question?
I'll come in, sorry. So about what I'm hopeful for, I think I'm hopeful about a lot, actually, and it was World Oceans Day yesterday, so happy belated World Oceans Day to everyone. And I'm also a big advocate for ocean optimism, so communicating real, positive conservation messages. And one of the things I'm hopeful about and ocean optimistic about is the Citizens' Assembly. You know, that's a real, I'm surprised it hasn't had more of a mention here this last couple of days, but that's a real opportunity for, you know, representatives of Ireland, you know, that's what that group of people are, to consider the issues and to come up with strong, considered, evidence-based, you know, recommendations that, if implemented, and I'll say it again, if implemented properly, in the long term, in the short term, then can and should drive change. But to come back to what Pádraic said, I think it's effectiveness of what we do now. We really need to hone in on what is effective and what actually delivers for nature. It was mentioned yesterday, I think, by Orla Delargy at the KPMG, talk about the action plan, about impact. I think Orla had said, you know, what's the impact of what we do? I think there's consensus. There seems to be consensus that we need urgent action. We need urgent action that's effective, and we don't have time to wait anymore. And also the other thing, just quickly, that keeps coming up throughout the different sessions I've been to, is scale, is how we scale up the really successful projects that we've been hearing about at a local level, how we scale that up to beat this incremental change that we've experienced that isn't necessarily working, to become transformative.
Thanks, Donal. Michael, did you want to come in?
Yeah, there was one line in the overview document that was presented and published at the start of the conference that really struck me, that the next plan should have an increased focus on the root causes of biodiversity loss rather than the consequences of biodiversity loss. And I think that's a hugely important statement, because if we really want to tackle this issue, we have to have a conversation, and a real conversation about the root causes. What that conversation could look like, I'd like to just quote briefly some of the statements made by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity. It's an equivalent of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they jointly produced a report last year outlining the type of things that need to happen for us to have that real discussion about the root causes. They said we need transformative change with rapid and far-reaching actions that have never been tried before. We need a collective and individual value change. We need to recognise that market dynamics don't care about biodiversity, and as long as we keep the similar market-based system we have, we won't tackle this issue when we focus on metrics like GDP and growth within a finite bounded planet. And they gave the example about, a bit like climate change, governments' priorities can be always told by where their money is put. And governments spend 4 to 6 trillion globally yearly in exploiting nature rather than protecting nature. And I'm sure if we had somebody doing the sums in Ireland, it would be a similar equivalent here. So unless we're willing to talk about these issues as part of the discussion of the next plan, I'll be really hopeful if we're having that discussion, but if we're not, I think we'll be back here in 5 years having the same discussion.
Thanks. Thanks, Michael. Sadhbh?
Yeah, I'd like to echo some of those remarks, actually, and I work mostly in climate policy rather than biodiversity, but I think the barriers to effective action are very similar, and they are barriers, if you like, to effective action in defence of the environment generally. We operate under the assumption, I think, that the state and policymakers are acting in the public interest. And there's a lot of goodwill here in the room amongst all of us, and there's a perception that we're all on the same page, perhaps. But in reality, policymakers, that include elected officials and civil servants, are often under siege by lobbyists and vested interests. And sometimes other state agencies and government departments who are trying to undermine policy initiatives. And policy process is very easily corrupted, and I don't use that word unadvisedly, with bad science and made-up facts that suit polluters, whose overriding agenda is really dismal logic of business as usual. And I have some examples for you that are just from this week alone. Firstly, the packaging industry is working very hard this week to undermine the passage of the Circular Economy Bill, which is a wide-ranging piece of framework legislation that gives the Minister power to introduce the so-called latte levy. But there's a lot more to the bill besides that, and it had cross-party support in the Dáil and is now being undermined by lobbying by the packaging industry and some retailers. The European industries undermining the reforms to the emissions trading scheme. We've seen that tanking in the European Parliament just this week. The dairy, beef and some parts of the agri-lobby determinedly watering down the proposed emission ceilings for climate action. And of course the Nitrates Action Programme and many other initiatives that have bedevilled, I suppose, the climate agenda in the agri-sector. So I think we just need to be really honest about what the obstacles to effective action on biodiversity are. Policies won't work if they are weakened and watered down by vested interests or just not implemented or resourced properly. Now, a lot of work has gone into looking at that, which is very welcome in the biodiversity space. But let's think about it in terms of our democracy as well. Representative democracy might be the best system of government we have, but it does have its weaknesses. Our elected members are very accessible to us, and we like that. We feel connected to our political system, but they're also very accessible to vested interests and local interests as well. And the only opposition that is effective to that type of pressure is a strong voice from civil society. So these people here in civil society, the ENGOs working together, push back against that, representing the real interests of citizens and nature, pushing back against that power. But I don't think people appreciate how powerful the lobbying is from the industry side. And unless we have a powerful civil society, we will not get our voices heard.
Thank you. Thank you. So the next question I have really focuses on the links between people, food production, climate, and nature. Oonagh and Michael, can you bring us through these connections and how our current food systems are impacting both people and planet? And then if others would like to come in as well. Thank you.
Well, I mean, farming has been going on in Ireland for millennia, I think. It's a very important sector to our economy. It is interesting as well, though, because for a long time, farming has worked hand in hand with nature, and an awful lot of species, wild birds and habitats are there because of low intensity, low input grazing and what we would call high nature value now. But for a long time, that was the traditional type of grazing in Ireland. And I suppose a lot has changed with the Common Agricultural Policy coming into being, and the demands, I suppose, for more food in one sense. But when you look at the prices that farmers are getting for their food, for the food they produce, and the increased obligations that they have to meet different environmental legislation, safety, and all the rest of it, the result is that they're getting less for what they make, and it's turning into a system now where we've moved to heavily subsidized, very resource-intensive system to increase the outputs, to make sure that the farmers can get so that they have a good livelihood. So what's happened, though, is that nature has suffered along the way, because it's still the scale of the inputs, the scale of the intensification has resulted in a lot of damage. And so now we're looking at, we know there's a biodiversity crisis, we know there's a climate crisis, we know that emissions have really ballooned in agriculture, and all the indicators are really going in the wrong direction. So what is the policy response? And that response is some tweaks, some really positive things are going to be in the next Common Agricultural Policy, especially the cooperative projects, and that they will probably get, we hope, maybe around 700 million out of a 9.8 billion euro budget. And that's just not enough if we're going to turn the tide on this, to turn the tide on habitat loss, on loss of species, and especially wild birds and pollinators. So really what we need to see is that connection, that the payments for public goods to be higher up in the agenda, to be driving the use of that public money. And unless, I don't think we're going to make it this CAP, because that decision on the CAP strategic plan is going to be made within the next few weeks. I've been sitting on the CAP consultative committee now for 2.5 years, and it's been a good dynamic process to a level playing field in that regard, but whether we're fully listened to is another thing, because the policy and agri-food strategy is driving this intensification and this high level of production, which is at the cost of our environment, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Oonagh. Michael?
My remarks will be about looking at food production as part of a system, and we can't draw a line around Ireland in terms of our food system. Ireland, the food that we import and a lot of the food that we eat has biodiversity consequences around the world. And also the agricultural system that we have, 90% is exported around the world, and a lot of the inputs to those final products come from around the world. So when we're thinking about biodiversity, agriculture and food systems, like other economic systems that we're involved in, are part of a global supply chain. And we have to take cognizance of that when we're looking at biodiversity. If we got to a stage where Ireland was able to design a successful farming within nature system, we'd still be getting inputs and still be getting food from the outside. So we have to also look at biodiversity at a global level. And at a global level, the systems that are pushing against farmers, both in Ireland and around the world, are ones that Ireland has negotiated for and sees as beneficial. And what they're beneficial for is large agri-producers, the concentration of power, Oxfam did a report a few weeks ago looking at the food crisis and the cost of living in crisis. If you look at our website, you'll see it, but you'll see the huge amount of profits being made by various multinationals, both globally and in Ireland. And the system is designed to achieve that. But the farmers that we work with who are preserving biodiversity, a lot of their work depends on sharing seeds, developing seeds that are relevant to their various ecological situation. And that's becoming harder and harder to maintain. So there's very specific things that Ireland could do to help on a global level. And one is we're part of a coalition that's looking at what's called business, human rights and environmental legislation. And if this legislation is passed, it would ensure that all businesses, including agri-food companies, would have to undertake a due diligence process within their supply chain to ensure there's no human rights or environmental abuses in that. And that would be legislated here so people could bring it to the courts here. The huge difficulty with this is the people that are impacted by the choices that we make here on a global level don't have any power or legal status to bring the big actors to court. This legislation would be transformational. So I would put out a call in terms of looking at biodiversity in the fourth plan. We can't just look at it about Ireland. Our footprint is wider than Ireland, and we need to take account of the negative impacts that we have in relation to that.
Thank you, Oonagh and Michael. Did anyone else want to come in on food systems? Okay. So the next question is, I know one that's really close to all of our hearts as advocates and members of an active and vibrant civil society, and that is, how do we bring people and communities along in the journey towards halting and reversing biodiversity loss in Ireland? And especially, how do we bring young people with us? Anabel, I'd like to go to you first, if that's okay.
Thank you. Well, I think something I've heard repeated a lot of times at the conference is the whole government, whole society approach. And I think this is really important and key in involving communities. And one thing I've also heard a lot at this conference is that we need to involve the youth and young people. However, I'm the only young person here. So I think... Thank you. And I think that efforts are being made definitely with the Young People Citizens Assembly, but I think for definitely citizens and students of a certain age, they could be involved at a level such as this. And I think to involve students and young people in our efforts to improve our world and our planet, we need to really educate our young people. And for biodiversity, I believe this starts at a really young age, including at preschool and at a level at very young students, as they truly are able to connect with nature in a way we can all remember connecting with nature as children. And I think that they connect with animals on a different level than adults, perhaps. And I think this is very key in involving them and encouraging them to support biodiversity, and even supporting biodiversity locally in their communities. And in older levels, children in secondary school and in second level institutions, we can support them with courses such as biodiversity short course for the junior cycle. At this, there's also a climate action short course for the junior cycle, which I was involved with, and this is key as it relates to all the subjects students are studying in school already, such as science and geography. They all connect together. However, there's no course being taught or project being done by students to show how they connect and how they connect to biodiversity and climate, as they truly are interconnected. And I think that students really will take action if you tell them to and if you want them to. So I think we need to show them how they can do this, and not only how they can be advocates, but also how they can research and how they can use science to their advantage, as we sometimes are just seen as advocates without the evidence behind us. And I think that it's key that we are given the evidence behind us, and that for the whole of society is shared with the data that is collected, especially on biodiversity. And a lot of efforts I've heard these 2 days are being made by local communities to research their local areas and encourage biodiversity in their local areas. And I think that all of these local communities are working really hard and have made great progress, but if we don't, as was said earlier, if we don't scale up and work together as a global community, as an all-Ireland community, none of these efforts will have a true impact on the whole of Ireland. So I think if we can find a way to involve the youth and all the generations in the community to really take actionable actions and be encouraged to support the environment, it would be amazing.
Sadhbh, did you want to come in on this as well?
Yeah, I think I agree completely with Anabel in that it all starts with environmental education. But I think we need to think beyond environmental education as well and look to something like ecological literacy as a framework for that change in values that Michael referred to earlier. And what do I mean by that? A kind of an understanding that these issues cut across disciplines and perspectives, and we need to incorporate understandings of gender, of place, and of inequality in society as well. I think that at the core of it, we need to have an understanding that we're operating within limits, that we have to respect planetary boundaries regardless of what we're doing, what our economic activity is, our job, our livelihoods, whatever, where we live, and that we have a duty to protect and restore nature, and that probably means setting aside a lot of land for nature in order for other species to thrive. And that requires a degree of humility that we don't often hear expressed, and certainly not something that you hear in public policy. And I think that we have to act with future generations in mind. So we need that long-term vision, a sense of our legacy, that the impact that we are having now on the environment will last in the atmosphere and in the soil for hundreds, if not thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. So that requires a total change in outlook, but it can also be rather overwhelming. So I think critical to the process going forward is a renewed public participation approach. Now, we have certain legal rights under the Aarhus Convention to public participation and a right to know. But in Ireland, the way that's been implemented is very narrow, it's expensive, it's legalistic, and if you want to take any legal actions in defence of the environment, it's extremely costly and very, very difficult. So in order to transform that, we need a sense of being able to meaningfully engage at a local level in ways that our voices are included and heard. And as I said, that we're not drowned out by vested interests or that policy processes are happening in another room while we're all deliberating very eloquently here about biodiversity. I think we need to have a look at our framework legislation, not just in terms of additional protections for biodiversity and the environment, but also rights to nature. There was a very important court case taken a couple of years ago by Climate Case Ireland, and the High Court judge, although he ruled against the case, did acknowledge that there was a right to a healthy environment consistent with human well-being and dignity that you could read into the Constitution even if it wasn't explicitly said. Unfortunately, that was overturned by the Supreme Court. But I think we need to revive that discussion and think about maybe constitutional amendments without making everything long-term and long-fingering everything, but thinking about how we might incorporate an understanding of rights to a healthy environment in domestic law, in the way we implement air quality legislation as well as biodiversity. But I'd also like us to think about rights of nature too, because I don't think that we have a right to drive other species to extinction. To me, that is morally abhorrent, and we do this every day as a result of our economic activities. I don't know how we can incorporate that into law, but if it can be done, I think it would be progress indeed.
Thanks. This question is open for anyone else on the panel. Pádraic.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. Obviously, support completely what the previous speakers have said. But I think one of the great things we have in Ireland is amazing communities. We have amazing people, and a lot of them have been showcasing their work here today and yesterday. But a lot of those communities will say that, you know, the barrier to their progress is funding, resources, or maybe the fact that you have state agencies next door doing things that are in opposition to the things that you're trying to achieve. So it comes back, I feel, to the role of the state in leading on our climate and biodiversity crisis. And the state is uniquely positioned to do an awful lot of things that communities can't do. I don't think it's a problem getting community support. Communities are already supporting this and already much behind it. And just maybe to build on a point that Sadhbh has made about the role of civil society. I mean, the last year in Ireland has been a difficult one for many people working in civil society, not me or my organisation in particular, but others that have tried to take their right, like every other citizen of this country, to the courts. And I said it was great to see the Taoiseach here this morning, but the Taoiseach stood up in the Dáil last year and more or less denounced one of our organisations, An Taisce, for taking illegal action that was well within their rights. And that's the kind of bullying and oppression, I think, that can happen when civil society does things that maybe the state doesn't like. So it's very important that those rights are upheld.
Yeah, well, I think I would agree with everything that's been said, and I have also been encouraged by pretty much every speaker, I think, at the conference has highlighted the importance of talking to communities and this public engagement and, you know, being inclusive and open and transparent in that process. And one example just from yesterday, the Corncrake presentation, the LIFE project, you know, they were knocking on doors, speaking to people face to face in their own homes and properties, and I think that's really powerful. And the success of that project has borne out the success of that approach. But I work for Fair Seas, so our focus is on the conservation, protection, and restoration of our seas and of our marine environment, and a big part of that is marine protected areas. And we published a report yesterday identifying areas of high biodiversity and species richness that we think should be considered areas of interest, we call it, for designation of MPAs. But in that report, we also state the importance of interacting, engaging with local communities in a significant, open, transparent, ongoing way. And it's not just because I think what Sadhbh was getting at, and Pádraic as well, because it's the right thing to do, but also because it results in better outcomes for nature as well. You know, there's evidence around the world from MPAs about when they're bottom up and when they have that community buy-in and trust, and there's a working relationship there, that the MPAs benefit, biodiversity in those MPAs benefit as well, and it fosters a culture of trust, but also then you can implement elements of co-design, co-management, and ultimately all that serves to build pride in local communities in biodiversity in their area, and as I said, then benefits the nature that we all love and want to protect. So it's just a case study, I guess, to show that, you know, we should include people in decision making about environments, maybe everything, but the environment, because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's the right thing to do for nature as well.
Thanks very much, Donal, and to all of our panellists on that question. I'd like to move on specifically, and this is a great segue, Donal, to a question about our rivers, lakes, streams, and seas. So why are they so important when talking about Ireland's biodiversity?
Yeah.
And Donal?
Yeah, I'll go first. Yeah, I'll go again. So I think the first thing to say about why biodiversity important in our seas, I'll talk about primarily, is that, you know, our sea and marine environment in Ireland here, 7 times the size of our landmass. So, you know, automatically the space for plants, animals, seaweeds, everything else to actually live and exist in is huge. So that we do have a lot of biodiversity in our seas, but more than that, you know, healthy, diverse, resilient ecosystems, marine ecosystems are really important for our health, for our well-being. Taoiseach mentioned it earlier. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say for our survival as well. You know, individually and as a society, half the oxygen we breathe is derived from the ocean. There's been a really fantastic session earlier on in a talk about blue carbon, about how our marine ecosystems, habitat species can contribute to carbon sequestration in a huge way, given the scale of our ocean environment globally and here in Ireland. And also food provision as well. You know, it's really important We were talking about food earlier on, but it's estimated a third of the global population rely on protein derived from the sea as their primary source of protein. So I think we underestimate the importance of healthy, functioning, natural functioning, diverse, resilient marine ecosystems at our own peril. And just to pick up on something maybe that Sadhbh had said as well, is there's been a lot of talk this last 2 days about ecosystem services, and it's just right that we highlight the ecosystem services that nature provides us. But I'll happily fly the flag for what I learned in school as the intrinsic value of nature, and I love the sea, and I don't love it, and I didn't begin to love it because it provided me with air to breathe, although maybe I should have. But it's because it's everything in it. It's fascinating, and it's beautiful, and it's intricate, and it's complex, and it's simple all at the same time. And there's a way to value nature that sits outside ecosystem services and the ways in which it helps us create wealth and productivity.
Thanks, Thank you for the love letter to the sea, which is wonderful. Pádraic, I was looking for hope, and I think we just got a little bit. Pádraic, over to you.
The hope is over that end. Water. Ireland is such a wet country. We're surrounded by water. Water is completely fundamental. And you might say, well, God, we should really do something about our water. It's 20 years since the European Union brought in a Water Framework Directive. We're on our third river basin management plan that was supposed to have achieved good status for all of our waters everywhere by 2015. That's 7 years ago. It's 30 years since the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, which said we were going to stop the halt to biodiversity and we were going to stop climate change. And, that's 3 decades ago. The whole lifetimes have come and gone. And so here we are at our 4th National Biodiversity Plan. And so really, this disconnect that's mentioned between things that we know are completely vital to our lives and our societies, and yet we're completely trashing it, despite all of these laws and plans and everything. And I think, ironically, maybe what we need is another law. But one of the reasons why we're completely failing in our implementation of biodiversity action plans is because it has no status whatsoever. There's no mechanism for its implementation. There's no penalty to anybody for not doing any of the things. There's no responsibility on other government departments to read it, never mind, do the things it says. So maybe one way forward out of the rut that we're in is putting biodiversity on a par with climate. So we have a Climate Act, we have a formal structure now for implementing that. Yes, we're failing on that as well. But it is, I think, combined with greater public support and greater public pressure and the ethical response that I think some of the other speakers were talking about, the sense of wonder and the rights of nature, then that provides us with the way out. Laws are really important, but on their own they're not enough. But I definitely think making the Biodiversity Action Plan statutory, and something Minister Noonan said he wanted to do yesterday, is a really critical role if we're not going to be back here in 3 years' time wondering why we're still not succeeding in our task.
Thanks, Pádraic. Thank you. So, we've got one more question.
Just to mention one thing. So just on that point about the law and the biodiversity impact report that when we do the independent review of the biodiversity, was it the evaluation last year? It found that the state was the biggest transgressor of EU law in Ireland. And one of the things I'd like to ask is, who's holding our state bodies to account? And we can't always be looking to the European Commission to do this. Nationally, I think there needs to be a way to hold government departments to account for breaches of the law, for making sure that legislation, the most basic thing, that the legislation is adhered to. But when there are transgressions, that there's accountability. And somehow that is really falling through the cracks. And I think that would be a suggestion for the biodiversity action plan, that somehow there's consideration of this and a mechanism put in place.
Thanks, Oonagh. Making sure our rapporteur gets that suggestion. We have a rapporteur who's recording all of our recommendations from this session. So our final question before we turn it over to you, because we'd really love to hear your voice for nature this afternoon, is we know and we keep hearing that the biodiversity and climate emergencies are inextricably linked and should be tackled together. What would Ireland and the world look like if we were on the road to addressing these crises? Michael, yeah.
My daughter is going to be raging when I go home and tell her that Anabel is sitting beside me. She's going, well, why couldn't I sit here? And I think that's what the world needs to look like. The people who are going to be most impacted by both these, you know, some of it is going to be in my lifetime, but most of it is in younger people's lifetime. They have the most at stake in the decisions being made. And I think more young people, you know, seriously involved in policy making, rather than tokenistically, you know, brought forward and said, look, we have a few young people and then let the adults decide it. So a world where the people who are most impacted by the decisions we're making, involved in the decision-making process, would be a world I'd like to see.
Yeah, I guess in climate policy in particular, there's a lot of emphasis on modelling and scenarios and, you know, pathways. You know, we hear about those in the context of IPCC reports. But I think sometimes that can be, it can be a kind of exclusive kind of conversation, that you have to be very technically literate to engage in that kind of mapping out the future conversation. And increasingly, I find myself more drawn to conversations about what we're doing. What are we doing here? Why are we here? You know? And I think if you're not, and I say this, and I really mean it, if you're not an activist at this point, then why are you here? Because there's microplastics falling out of the sky in Antarctic snow right now this week. We are in an unprecedented emergency, and we are at the point where we need to down tools and start collaborating and working on fixing and restoring and addressing all these problems that we have allowed accumulate over time. So I'm not sure that we need a scenario. We just need to do stuff, and we need to work together, and we need to start thinking and acting like, you know, embodied human beings and not detached brains. So I suggest that we all, you know, reflect on that. And I say that I'm here, you know, as an academic. And usually academics are supposed to have this kind of objective distance about everything. But I'm sorry, I'm past that. It's too late for that. And it's not just about my children's future. This microplastics is falling out of the sky in my lifetime. So I care about it. So I would urge everybody to think of themselves as activists in whatever capacity you have, in whatever role you have in policy making, inside government, outside government, working in the private sector, in whatever profession or in whatever capacity you are here. Think of yourself as an activist, and that brings you into a big community of people who care.
Would anyone else like to come in on that question? Anabel.
Yes, I agree with everything that's been said already, and I think one of the things that would be amazing is to see biodiversity and climate change linked in communities and in the actions that are being taken by communities. And I think, as was said earlier, communities really want to be involved and want to take action. However, sometimes there aren't resources there for that to happen, or the communities don't fully have an understanding of what actions need to be taken. And I think, as I said earlier, we need to work on teaching communities and working with the policymakers, and those in government need to work with communities individually on how to take action locally so that it can be seen at a global level. That's what I have to say.
Thanks, Anabel. So I think what we're going to do is now turn it over to the audience. I'm going to figure out the app to see how we can get some questions that might be coming in online as well. I hope there are some questions. I know there's a roving mic. Okay, there's a good few. Okay, is that Evie? Okay. I'm going to take a few together at a time, and then so that we can get through as many as possible.
Karen, I'm so sorry because this isn't actually a question, but it's more a response to what's being said. So my name is Aoibhinn Ní Shúilleabháin. I'm chairing the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss, and I'm here learning for the past 2 years and didn't have the foresight to come 3 years ago. And it's fantastic to learn about all of the things that are happening and to see all the interested people and to know there's so many more online. But for one thing that has been striking me is there's so much underway in terms of policy, and we will have this action plan, and we'll have a Citizens' Assembly. And it feels like there's a lot of momentum. But it's really important, in my mind, that we get the people who aren't in this room on board, and the people who don't necessarily think they know a lot about biodiversity and don't necessarily think they understand about the implications in their lives. So as a response to, because a lot of people have said, we need to get the public on board in order to make sure that the policymakers get to implement everything that we are saying here, that may be said in recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly, and I don't know what those 99 members will recommend yet. But if I can have an ask to add to that activism that Sadhbh just said, just something, one small thing, go and talk about the Citizens' Assembly to your friends, your neighbours and your family. Because the research shows that the more people know about a Citizens' Assembly, the more likely the recommendations are to be implemented. And I have full faith in our 99 members of the Citizens' Assembly that they will learn as much as they can about biodiversity loss and try and tackle it in our terms of reference. So if I can just ask everyone as one small action to just talk about the Citizens' Assembly and let people know what's happening, because then they're more likely to tune in to what the recommendations might be at the very end. So thanks, Karen.
Thank you. Okay. Is that maybe you two? Yeah.
Hello, Cody Presence, my name, from the Irish School Sustainability Network. So we're a collection of teachers and students who work together to make our schools more sustainable. But the reality is that there's not, and it was mentioned there by Anabel, there's not enough climate and nature education in our schools. And what I see here, just at the conference, I was scrolling through the programme, there's lots of different departments, but I didn't see any representation from the Department of Education. So I think there needs to be more resources given to schools, there needs to be more training for teachers. Anecdotally, in my classroom, I ask kids the names of certain birds and plants and animals. They don't know the names of, really, really common birds that are flying around their heads because nobody's ever taught them. So I think just our message from the Irish School Sustainability Network is we need more resource for schools, more training for teachers, and for the Department of Education to really take a leadership role here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Karen, can I just respond there? Because notwithstanding the bigger point about education needing to be represented here, but just to say that on the Birdwatch Ireland website we do have resources for teachers, just so you're aware, and it's free. So. Oh, okay. Thanks.
Yeah. On the end.
Thanks. Duggan. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in UCD, and I don't have a question, I apologise, but I have a love letter of my own, and it's a love letter to soils. So this is the hidden biodiversity that we have in Ireland. And so I guess in terms of a gap that I might have noticed in the last 2 days, this is Ireland's National Biodiversity Conference. And even though it's been touched on by, I think, Senator Pippa Hackett, and even the Taoiseach himself touched on biodiversity in our land, we haven't been talking about the biodiversity inside our land, under our feet, in the ground. We've been talking about in multiple sessions about how much data we have and all these initiatives, and what actions are we going to take now? Well, what data do we have about the biodiversity on the island of Ireland in the soils that sustain the life above ground? So I just wanted to plant that seed into everyone's mind to remember that if we want to encapsulate all of biodiversity and make a plan to address it, we need to not forget about the life and the biodiversity that exists beneath our feet. And on that, I'll just plug the fact that in March 2023, Dublin will be hosting the 3rd Global Soil Biodiversity Conference. So if you're interested, you might go along to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hi, Michael Keegan is my name. I'm a farmer, and just not too many farmers here that I can see that I know anyway. I suppose the reason for that is that a lot of farmers see this as something that just costs money and doesn't actually make money. And not that it has to be all about making money either, but farming is a business at the end of the day. And I think it would be good to bring farmers with you on this journey. It would need funding, and like, unless there's going to be funding, allocated to this sort of work, it's just never going to happen. So it's just a comment, really.
Thanks. What I might do is take another comment or question, and then maybe the panel might respond to that in a moment, if that's okay, because I think we just have 5 minutes left. Is that Dermot? Great.
Apologies, yet another comment rather than a question following in the footsteps of other interventions. Dermot Torney from Dublin City University, just to follow up on some of the themes around education and young people, but also Evine's comments. Myself and some colleagues in DCU and in UCC have been funded by Minister Malcolm Noonan's department to design and implement Children and Young People's Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity loss. That's going to be running in the autumn in parallel with the Adults Citizens' Assembly, and we hope engaging in an intergenerational dialogue between the Adults Assembly and the Children and Young People's Assembly. We're just at the moment recruiting members for a Children and Young People's Advisory Team. The deadline for that is on Sunday. I think Evine hopefully mentioned that in her presentation at the conference. If anyone is interested in finding out more, please come and talk to me afterwards. The assembly itself is going to be taking place. We'll be recruiting members in the early autumn and then running the assembly in the later autumn. So please keep an eye out for that as well. And I just wanted to make the audience aware of that. Thanks.
Thanks, Dermot. I see some more hands raised maybe over there, and then we'll have the panel respond. So lady in white T-shirt. Yeah.
Farrell, a teacher, and you may not have heard that there is a trillion tree project going on in this UN decade on ecosystem restoration. And the United Nations Environment Programme have handed their map over to the children of the world to restore these trillion trees. So our one small step for nature for you today is we're lucky in Ireland that we can plant a tree at any time of the year. With our Easy Treesy project, with collaborators from all over the country, we had planted 30,000 trees the last time we were here 3 years ago. That November, with Science Foundation Ireland, we planted 30,000 in 1 week all around the country during Science Week. So there is only the will stopping us planting 1 billion trees on this island this decade. The technical advisor to the Tree Council, Dr. Gerhard Gallagher, who has literally written the book on land use in Ireland, says that nothing is stopping us but the will to do this. Now, going home on my bicycle today, I could fit into my handbag and my little carry bag the 300 saplings that I'm allowed to plant at a time currently in Ireland without planning. So that is one block that we have to planting our 1 billion trees. So my appeal to those making policy is to remove roadblocks so that we can take mass actions of this sort, which would bring down our global temperature by 1 degree and do a very great deal to help biodiversity. Anyone who's ever had a baby with a temperature knows if you bring the temperature down first, things get easier.
Thanks, Willa. I know. Okay, would anyone else like to come in with a final comment or question before we have our panel respond? I see a couple hands at the front.
Hi, I'm Ali Norman. I'm a student in Galway. So really what I noticed here is it's very one department or two departments are here. There's not a lot of representatives, the Department of Health, whereas biodiversity is so all-encompassing. How do you propose we get that across to all the different sectors and actually work together across all these different groups to help our biodiversity?
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi there. My name is Emer Stevenson. I'm an ecologist at JBA Consulting, as well as a master's student at Trinity College. But this whole conference I've quite felt underrepresented in terms of like youth, and I just wanted to kind of point that out and kind of thank Anabel for being here today and for pointing that out. And I think it's brilliant that we have this youth today. So yeah, thank you.
I think there was one more question up here. Yeah. Great. And then I think we'll hear some final words from the panelists.
Hi there. Thank you. I'm Keith Scanlon. I'm an environmental volunteer in North Wicklow and South Dublin. I gave the Taoiseach some suggestions for announcements he should make in his speech this morning, the biggest quick wins on biodiversity. He didn't take them. He said he'd think about them later. But would you agree the single biggest quick win we could do for biodiversity, for climate, and for reducing our dependency on Russian energy and energy efficiency would be if we all agree to set the maximum speed at 80 kilometres per hour on all national roads. We're trying this locally in Wicklow, and you can also pledge and sign up to do this on www.80max.ie. But please help us ask the Taoiseach and the 31 local authorities to do this across the country. We believe it's the single biggest win we can do this week. Would you agree?
Thanks. Okay, so there was one question or a comment and a question by Michael Keegan around costs, around restoring and protecting nature on farmlands, and that it is viewed by some as costing money, but it potentially doesn't make any money. Would any of our panelists like to come back on that? Oonagh, Sadhbh?
Yeah, I mean, well, there are some measures that don't cost anything, and that's kind of like leaving your hedgerows grow taller, and I know taller at least. I know wider can have implications for cap payments, but for sure, incentivizing and providing those funds to help farmers do measures that support biodiversity, they have to be provided. And I suppose my point that I made at the start was that there's really only going to be about 700 million in the 9.8 billion euro cap budget between 2023 and 2027 that's going to go to support farmers for effective action. I mean effective action. There are some other funds that are going to go for biodiversity action, but it's questionable how effective they're going to be. So that's a tiny percentage of the overall budget. So we really need to redirect that funding to the right places where we want it to go and for it to support results-based approaches. But besides that as well, though, what's really important is the advice and support, the ecological support to support farmers, because we find working with on-the-ground conservation projects at Birdwatch Ireland, working with farmers on curlew and other species is, most farmers are absolutely amazed at what's on their farm. They're proud of it, of the biodiversity they have. And if they, when they learn about them, they have certain species, it's rare that you'd see it that they're a cause of trouble, for the farmer. So, that pride is there. There's a lot of goodwill there as well. But getting the advice, the farm advisory services really need to be upskilled to a very high level, I think. And I think that's a big ask because they're charged with addressing climate and water as well, and just doing not farm plans, but the applications. So it is a big ask, but I think if we could get that right, and I think it'll take a number of years, that support for farmers, I think, must come with the funding. To help to achieve what we need.
Thanks, Oonagh. Sadhbh, did you want to come in there as well?
Yeah, no, I'd like to come in on this because, Mike, it's absolutely brilliant that you're here. It is fantastic, and I'm going to make a couple of comments, but they're not really about you. So I've been involved in environmental advocacy now for, nearly 3 decades, and I've heard this point made many times that, we need to work together and we mustn't leave farmers behind. But my practical experience of trying to talk to the agricultural lobby is that it runs as far away from environmentalists as it can. So the issue is something a little bit different. Very often environmentalists are trying to communicate a message to policymakers, but that's understood as a criticism of individual farmers. We've always been extremely careful, and I've learned a lot from working with my colleagues Oonagh and Pádraic and others in the environmental movement, to be extremely careful about how we communicate our message. But the problem is, and it's a deep problem, I'm afraid, within the agricultural sector, that there is a blurring of lines between farmer representative organisations and the industries that are profiting from this very extractivist model, in terms of the representation and contributions that are made to farming organisations, and in terms of the sponsorship by agricultural machinery, seed, fertiliser, all the rest of it, to various events and activities. So that kind of blurring of lines wouldn't happen, I think, or would be a very rare thing to happen amongst civil society organisations that are funded through philanthropy or through member donations. But it's unfortunately extremely common in the agricultural sector. And compounding that difficulty is the agricultural media sometimes is extremely hostile to the environmental message, sometimes prints stuff that is profoundly incorrect. It's very difficult to have reasonable dialogue when you have misinformation, misrepresentation, and sometimes downright denial. So I think that's an issue that you can't, as an individual farmer, address, but I think it does make it very difficult to have the kind of collaboration that I can clearly see you want to have.
Thanks, Sarah. And there was one more question from Keith, and that is, would you agree with the 80 kilometres per hour rule? I saw one person come online, Keith, and say, good man. Excellent idea. Pádraic?
I wanted to come back maybe on some of the other points that were made around the room. The teacher down here made a point about how children don't know the names of birds. Most people, no matter what their age, don't know the names of birds, and they don't know the names of trees, and they don't know the names of common plants. So the education challenge that we have ahead of us is enormous. But remember this, 3 years ago, when we were all at this conference in 2019, none of us had heard of COVID-19, and now we're all experts. And why is that? Because there was a massive public education campaign everywhere, on bus stops, on radios, in newspapers. We knew everything about it. We could tell you the hour numbers and the many people were in intensive care in Tullamore. And so that's the level of education that is needed. So, I don't think we have to stop wringing our hands and saying we have to get this into schools. We're way beyond that. That was when I was in primary school in the 1980s, that was the message, and that hasn't happened. So the education thing is essential, but it's doable if the will was there and we treated it like an emergency. The lady who said, thanks, the lady who said about the trees, I think it's absolutely right that we need an awful lot more trees. I would point out that the trees are perfectly capable of planting themselves, and have been doing it for millions of years, and what we need to do is not necessarily plant trees, but establish forests. But they have to be done in the right way, and so we do need a proper regulatory system to do that. Finally, on Keith's point, I know nothing about carbon emissions from speeding cars, but if you want a quick win for climate and biodiversity, there are 2 things we could do very quickly. One is protect the ocean from industrial fishing, and the other one is to restore peatlands. And they would give enormous wins across all kind of water, biodiversity, climate in a very short space of time. And we could start doing that tomorrow, but we're not even doing that, except for maybe a few worthwhile peatland projects.
Thank you. So, I know we're 10 minutes over time. Are there any final kind of closing comments from our panelists?
Yeah, one quick one. There seems, from the comments of people, there's a lot of stuff going on and a lot of practical questions, because people are are primarily practical. They want to get stuff done. They want to get energy into things. And my observation would be, there's a reason why the practical things aren't happening. There's a reason why the funding and the priorities, money-wise, is the role of the state has been mentioned as being central to this. And I'm not sure the state has bought into the values of biodiversity and all the things that we've talked about today. Because if the state had bought into them, we wouldn't be having these practical questions about where do we get the money or why isn't the Department of Health. It would be happening already. So I would caution about getting too focused on the practical things without ensuring that the value is totally embedded in the way the state operates. And to get back to Sadhbh's point, the only way that can happen is by people being activated and ensuring that the state does its job for us and for nature.
Tell your politicians that nature is important to you.
Yeah.
Every one of them. Knock on their doors, because they're not going around knocking on doors at the moment. So.
I want to thank all of our panellists for this really, what I hope was an enriching discussion this afternoon, and hopefully we can start following up on these connections, and we can continue the work to be the voices for nature, because it's so needed now more than ever. Please give a warm round of applause for our panellists and yourselves, and especially for Anabel.